So that's how I got involved. He knew, we don't get a lot of serial murder cases. I know everyone probably thinks that the BAU works on every serial murder case. We don't. And we don't have like a bunch going on at once. Usually there's always one or two cases being worked on in the unit at a time, but it's really not that frequent as I guess people would think. And so when this one came in, my boss basically asked me, did I want to work on this case? And I said, yep, I'm already familiar with it. I'm very interested in working on it. So that's how I got involved. And it was at the request of the investigating agencies. And of course, at the time, they had formed all the different agencies, and there was about, I'm going to say 15 jurisdictions had gotten together to form a working group. And it was the first time, and this is back in 2011, I think. It was the first time all these agencies had gotten together and they decided we're going to share all our files. We're going to let everybody read everything. And we're going to put our heads together and we're going to solve this thing.
That's Julia Cowley, a retired FBI profiler and the host of the Consult podcast. This is the Silver Linings Handbook podcast. I'm Jason Blair. Julia Cowley is a retired FBI agent and criminal profiler. Julia spent decades in law enforcement investigating violent crime, including being a member of the famed Behavioral Analysis Unit, or BAU, at the FBI. Julia is currently the host of The Consult, a podcast made up of retired FBI profilers who just reached 1 million downloads 2 weeks ago. Julia has no problem saying that true crime is what led her toward forensic science and law enforcement. Prior to joining the FBI, Julia was a special agent and forensic scientist with the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation. She has a bachelor's degree in chemistry from the University of Oregon and a master's degree in forensic science from George Washington University. At the BAU, Julia was the lead profiler on the East Area Rapist and original Nightstalker cases that were combined into what now is known as the Golden State Killer case. The focus of our conversation today is going to be on the Golden State Killer and the real-life nightmare of Joseph DeAngelo. She also worked on the case of the serial killer Israel Keys in the early stages of the Long Island serial killer case. Julia also has had other assignments in the FBI investigating white-collar crime, public corruption, civil rights matters, and other topics in the Boston field office. The BAU is a highly competitive part of the FBI's Critical Incident Response Group that conducts analysis of behaviors and provides investigative and other support to law enforcement and prosecutors. Popularized by television shows like Mindhunter and Criminal Minds, and books and movies like The Silence of the Lambs, the BAU is well known for its study of serial killers, its classification of offenders connected to certain types of crime scenes, and is a part of high-profile investigations like the investigation of the Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski, the investigation of the killing of John Benet Ramsey, and the murder of the 4 students at the University of Idaho 2 years ago. Today, we're going to talk about the real-life nightmare of Joseph DeAngelo, what law enforcement and the public can learn about serial killers and their connected crimes, and tackle some of the misconceptions about the people that haunt and hunt us in ways that feel unimaginable. Before we get started, here's some background on the Golden State Killer case. On March 19, 1974, a sum of $50 in coins was stolen from a piggy bank in a home on West Walnut Avenue in the small Central California city of Visalia. Visalia is nestled in the agricultural-rich San Joaquin Valley. The population was less than 30,000 people at the time. It was the beginning of a 12-month reign of burglaries. The small area had more than 120 burglaries at the time. Most of the ransackings involved breaking into houses, rifling through, or vandalizing possessions, scattering women's underclothes, and stealing low-value items while leaving valuables. Instead of money, the burglar was more likely to steal from piggy banks and coin jars, stamps, foreign and historic coins, earrings, cufflinks, or medallions. Often, the ransacker would rearrange or display items around the homes. Eventually, a journalism college professor was murdered and a police detective was shot. Then, as soon as they started, they stopped. On Friday, June 18, 1976, at 4 in the morning, a woman was raped in her home 220 miles to the north in Rancho Cordova, California. It would begin a string of at least 50 rapes in the Sacramento and Modesto areas. Most of the victims had seen a prowler on their properties before, and many had experienced break-ins. Years later, several of the women would receive wistful or threatening phone calls that they recognized as the voice of being their rapist. It was believed that the attacker sometimes entered the homes in advance to unlock windows, unload guns, and plant ligatures for future use. Victims were often blindfolded and gagged so tightly that the victim's hands were often turned numb afterwards. At times, the rapist separated a couple, often stacking dishes on the man's back and threatening to kill everyone in the house if he heard the dishes rattle. At one point in 1976, during a rape, he repeatedly said, quote, "I hate you, Bonnie," to a woman who was not named Bonnie. Later, in 1978, a couple was murdered on the street that was eventually linked to the same person. The last rape committed by this man in this area, who became to be known as the East Area Rapist, occurred on Thursday, July 5th, 1979 at 3:45 a.m. After 3 years of terror, they just stopped. On Monday, October 1st, 1979, 300 miles south in Goleta, California, in Santa Barbara County, someone broke into a home and tied up a couple. After hearing the assailant say, quote, "I'll kill him myself," the couple tried to escape and the woman screamed. The intruder fled on a bicycle. A neighbor who is an FBI agent heard the noise and chased the person, who abandoned the bicycle and a knife and escaped through neighborhood backyards. On December 30th of that year, a couple was found shot to death in their condominium. The killer ate leftover Christmas turkey from the couple's refrigerator, leaving the remnants in the kitchen before leaving. 8 more murders would follow in a 7-year reign of terror. Hey, Julia. Thanks again, as always, for coming on for this, for one of our October episodes. And every October, I like to do, some themed episodes. And last year, we talked about Israel Keys, who is a sort of real life nightmare and boogeyman. And, I know the running idea with Israel Keys is not responsible for every murder that ever happened. But as I look at somebody like who we're going to talk about today, Joe DeAngelo, he seems even more frightening than someone like Israel Keys. And I think that there's probably a lot that we can learn from these types of stories, both about what we should worry about and what we shouldn't worry about. But I wanted to take a second to congratulate you. When you first came on the podcast in, I think, the spring of last year, the consult had been on a hiatus, and it's returned. And quite quickly, I think it was 2 weeks ago, you guys hit 1 million downloads. So congratulations to you, Bob, to Angela, to Susan. That is awesome.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I can't believe it. I remember when we were at 30 downloads. And I couldn't believe it.
You were like, who are these 30 people?
Well, they were all in like Oregon, where my family is, Oregon and the Seattle area. So but still, I just thought, wow, people are listening. So But it is hard to believe that we hit 1 million. It's kind of surreal.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and it goes back to what I think you and I talked about. I don't think we talked about it in an episode, but I had listened to a bunch of your early episodes before you took a hiatus, and I really believe that you guys brought a perspective to, I think, understanding true crime and crime that I couldn't get anywhere else, and not just on podcasts, but there's not a TV show, there's not a, Dateline doesn't do it. 48 Hours doesn't do it. There's not another place where you can get that kind of behavioral analysis of crime. And I think it's really just interesting. And it's been interesting to watch your community grow on Facebook and Patreon and see that it's really attracting a lot of smart people who want to think things through. And I just really am glad we have the space, and I kind of know we wouldn't have the space if you guys weren't willing to contribute to it. So I appreciate
thank you. And it's really just us talking about behavior. It's not scripted. Oftentimes we don't talk beforehand. Some of the cases that we're doing now, as you know, we had never profiled before. Some of them we have. And we get together and we haven't talked much. We may talk a little bit before we start recording, but most of what you hear is our profile unfolding. And so we may think we've exhausted a topic. We'll come back to it. We're like, wait a second, I think we need to go back to this. I forgot to bring that up. And it's, other than maybe taking out tangents that are completely unrelated or bathroom breaks, it's how a profile or how a consultation truly unfolds at the BAU.
Yeah, and I get that feeling that one of the cool things about it is we're getting the opportunity to kind of sit inside conversations that we wouldn't normally be a part of. And I've really enjoyed that piece of it. And, when you first came on, one of the things that we talked about was your work as a profiler and different cases that you had worked on. And one was Joe DeAngelo, who I think after his arrest or later in the case, he became known as it was the tail end of the case. He became known as the Golden State Killer. And, one of the things that I thought as I've read more about him and researched for this episode was that it really seems like the Golden State Killer doesn't really capture the breadth of crimes that he did or the amount of terror that he created, in those regions of California where he was operating. He was at one point, he was in Visalia, and he was the Visalia Ransacker and committed, 120 burglaries in central California. I know that there was a journalism professor who was killed there. There was a police officer who was shot. I don't know if those were linked, but it's, in a 20-month period, 120 burglaries and that kind of stuff in a small Central Valley town. Then you have, hundreds of miles away, you have the East Area Rapist, who's responsible for at least 50 rapes in the Sacramento and Modesto areas. And then, that happens for a 3-year period between 76 and 79. And then, you've got at least 10 people who are murdered hundreds of miles away in Santa Barbara. And that occurs, afterwards. And I'm just so curious to start out with how in the world did law enforcement ever connect all of these crimes?
DNA. It was 2001. And I'm going to say they weren't all linked by DNA because they didn't have DNA in every case, but they were able to link DNA to a couple of the murders and a few of the sexual assaults, particularly, I think, in the Contra Costa County area in Northern California, those rapes. And so then they knew that they were linked. And then the rest of them were linked by behavior and MO. That was how they were linked. And then, of course, as you mentioned, the Visalia ransackings, I know it doesn't seem like a big deal, just a bunch of ransackings, a bunch of burglaries. But as you mentioned, there was a man who was shot and killed by the offender, and he was shot and killed with a weapon that had been stolen in a previous burglary in Visalia. So he's, extremely violent, even during the time of his burglaries, extremely violent and very dangerous. So,
well, one of the things that just seems, or do I have this right? The idea that, you know, you have a little bit of DNA evidence in one of the cases, DNA evidence in other cases. Those make the connections between those individual cases. But those cases are sort of already connected independently, or at least the ones in the different regional areas were already connected based on the way that the perpetrator behaved.
yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, and now there was a double homicide that was not connected until later because they just hadn't tested the DNA, and that was eventually connected when it had not been connected through the behavior. So there was just a case they had no idea that it had been connected until the DNA hit. So that was connected a little bit later on our timeline. So, and then also the Visalia ransackings. I think some of the detectives thought Visalia could be related to the Sacramento area sexual assaults. That offender was known as the East Area Rapist at the time. And some detectives thought they were connected. I know the Visalia detectives thought they were likely connected. Sacramento didn't think so. There was some jurisdictional friction back in the day. And
right, because it never happens now.
right. Oh, no.
No, not at all. We're beyond that.
Yeah. So one of the things when they requested the assistance of the behavioral analysis unit, one of the things I wanted to do was do a linkage analysis and at least make a determination. Did we think the Visalia ransackings were linked to the East Area Rapist incidents and therefore linked to the murders in the Southern California area? So that was one of the things I wanted to do. It's kind of like I just wanted to settle it. Let's just see. Do we think they're linked?
What is a linkage analysis?
It's looking at the behaviors in the crimes when you don't have like forensic evidence and trying to see if there's similar behavior patterns that you see and that there's enough of it that you can say, yes, this is the same offender, or this is likely the same offender in each of these cases.
Because for me, in thinking about it, I'm just trying to imagine even how the detectives who thought it was connected even came to that conclusion. Because I'm thinking, on one hand, I've got a person who's like stealing medallions, change out of piggy banks, rearranging things around people's houses, taking some things, not necessarily taking valuables, you know, uh, messing around with women's underwear. And then in a completely different area, although during a different time, you have somebody who's breaking into people's houses, who is, raping people, and eventually, starts doing things like calling and threatening them afterwards. What kind of thread do you think for the initial investigators before the forensic evidence even got them thinking, maybe these things seem alike? Because at first blush, and thinking about the kinds of behaviors it takes to sort of I guess the similarities are you have to be a bit of a prowler to do a burglary or to do a home invasion rape. But are there other things that for them it stood out or seemed unique?
I think what stood out to them was just some of the basics that their series of burglaries ended and then the series of sexual assaults began. And these communities are about 4 hours apart. So I think that was kind of like, well, our offender stopped and then this series starts at another location. I think that was one of the things. I think the number of burglaries and the number of sexual assaults and the intensity of it was also something that struck them as being similar. And I think that's initially why they thought these could be related. Now, there wasn't a lot of communication between the agencies of sharing of information, so they couldn't look at they weren't looking at each other's files to see, well, can we really pin down some specific behaviors that would indicate, yeah, we 100% think or 99% think that these are related. And they just weren't doing that back then.
And that's where something like the linkage analysis comes in.
Well, I thought it was important because you had such a division, and I can understand why the detectives that thought they were not linked thought that, because you had very different offender descriptions in the two different areas. And it was also seemed like quite an escalation to go from these ransackings, these he would enter during the day when people weren't home. He'd ransack their houses and then he would leave. And then, of course, when he starts the sexual assault, he's breaking in into occupied homes. And so it seemed like a really quick escalation. Mm-hmm. And I think some people doubt it. So those were the two reasons why. So I understand why at first you'd think they can't be related. You have a completely different description of the offender, and it's a very quick escalation in violence.
Well, the one thing that does sort of strike me as similar, just thinking about it as you say it, is, a normal burglary, and not to say that there is really a normal, but I would imagine a normal burglar, like if I were to get into the business of burglary, I would wait to see that the person is not home or probably not home, have some idea of the patterns, pick a location where I can easily escape. Not to teach how to do a burglary here, but there's certain things that I would think you would normally do to commit a burglary to minimize your risk, increase the likelihood of your success in your haul, that the burglar in Visalia was not necessarily doing. He was hanging out for a while. He wasn't taking a lot of stuff. He's wasting time rearranging things in the house, taking things that might be valuable to people but aren't necessarily valuable in terms of resale. And that, to me, seems, in a weird way, a little bit more like an assault, right? That it's just this violation. It's almost like the person's getting their kicks out of violating people's spaces. And I don't know if is that normal for burglars to do things like that?
No, it's not. Most burglaries are committed purely for financial reasons. And when you see all this unnecessary behavior and spending extra time at the scene that you don't need to spend, increasing your risk for being there, you have to start thinking, okay, is there another motivation here at play? And for all the reasons you've just mentioned, you have to start thinking, okay, there's another reason that this person is spending all this time in the home and not just taking what he wants and leaving. He's spending a great deal of time going through their things, messing with their belongings. He's making it clear that he's violated their space.
Yep. Not being subtle about it whatsoever.
Not at all.
Yeah. And it reminds me of another thing further in the case. There's this one scene there's that one moment where it's already progressed to the rape, and he's in Southern California, I think. And it's in one of the murders where a couple was found shot dead in their condominium. And whoever the killer was, who we now know as DeAngelo, it was like December 30th, and he ate the leftover Christmas turkey from the refrigerator and then left it outside. And to me, that just felt very telling about what kind of, it almost feels like performatively callous uh almost sadistic in a way, but like that sense of violation, like I've walked into your house, I've shot you, and now I'm eating your food.
Right.
Um
And
and
he would do that in the sexual assaults as well, because he would go in, he would tie up his victims, he'd ransack their home, he'd go into their refrigerator, into their kitchens, eat their food, drink their drinks. He was very loud about it. So if he was drinking something, he'd be gulping really loud so that they could hear it. Just if you think about it, just think about you're in your home and you have a guest, and the guest just waltzes right in, opens up the refrigerator, starts taking out food and eating it. You'd just be, what? I mean, it's one thing if it's, a relative or a kid, but just imagine just somebody who doesn't come to your house very often, or the first time they've ever been there and they just help themselves.
it would be weird.
It would be very weird. You'd be taken aback. It would be kind of violating in a way. Like, that's my refrigerator.
Like,
and,
what are you
but
doing?
that's what he did. So he did do that. And then even in the murders, he did the same thing. It was similar behaviors that you would see not only in the ransackings or in this, and then in the sexual assaults, but then in the murders as well.
So there were some odd or not everyday things that sort of ran through like a thread through all of the crimes in some way.
Yes.
Yeah. And so
Very much so. It was not, I don't want to say it was not difficult, because it was a lot of material to review, but he had a very clear pattern. I've never seen an offender with such a clear pattern. I would start reading each incident report, and after a while, I'd just be like, yep, that's him. This is him. Every time. It was the same thing over and over and over again. Sometimes he'd use different language or say things in a different way, but his repeated patterns of behavior were very consistent.
So he really was repeating a cycle. I was thinking to myself that in the ransacking, the ransacking incidents, they start in Visalia, I think that's 73, and then for 3 years to 76. And I'm just trying to think of, I went back and I looked what was the population at the time. It was a little under 30,000. It's really boomed to like 120 now, but it's 30,000 people at the time. Lots of families. So, not an enormous number of households. To do 120 burglaries in such a short period of time, in such a small region, I would imagine that this was something that, got news coverage, that neighbors knew about, that people were on the lookout for. It seems both brazen for the offender and wild for what it must have been like for the community.
Yeah, it was very brazen. It was, as you said, there were so many in such a short period of time, and they were contained in certain neighborhoods. So he's very comfortable in certain areas of Visalia. And it appeared just by how close together they were that he was possibly on foot. So, these are some things you're starting to think about when you're looking at what we would call his, I guess, hunting ground or hunting grounds where he was comfortable. And that's another thing you see throughout these crimes is all the neighborhoods were very similar. He went into very similar style homes. It was like 3-bedroom, 1-bath or 2-bath ranch style homes where he knew the layout. He never went into homes that were multi-level. It was always very similar.
Kind of like where he would almost be able to know the layout or the layout options when he walked in. Because
Right.
there were other things I think I had read when he moved in 76, and the East Area rapists started striking there, that he would that there was a belief that he prowled and scoped out the location, sometimes broke in advance, unlocked windows, unloaded guns, all that stuff, left ligatures. It also, that sounds like an elaborate process. Sounds like it would take enormous amount of time and have a ton of risk. And I was wondering when I was reading about those things, like I can get the idea of like, okay, I unload your gun before I go in, but dropping off my ligatures, I guess maybe so, so I don't have to carry them out in the open and get arrested by them. But I'm also taking that same risk by coming in. I'm taking the risk that somebody finds them in there and knows something weird is going on. Like what? Do you think it was a game on some levels? Like he was playing a game with?
I think it was his fantasy. This is all, everything he's doing is based on his fantasy. And while we might think, oh, that's very risky, what he's doing is he's enjoying that, and he's fantasizing about, okay, when I come back later. And he didn't do this in every instance, but there are some cases where it is believed he went in and, for example, would go into a home during the day when no one's home, unlock a window so he can come in later at night. Or like you said, one person actually did find some ligatures. I think it was under a sofa cushion. And so he was, first and foremost, a prowler. Right. And enjoyed that. And so this is all building up to doing that. And whether he actually went back to those homes or not, I don't know that it mattered to him. He just loved entering homes and going through their things, being in their space, violating their...
Basically, it's almost like he's getting his kicks by violating people in whatever...
Yes. Yeah. There's a link between burglary and sex crimes as well. There's... not every burglary, but you do see in some violent sexual offenders who go on to become, rapists and serial rapists. Many have a history of burglary or peeping or voyeurism. So that, going into someone's unoccupied home and going through their belongings and looking at things, that's a form of voyeurism.
Yep. And the idea being, particularly that part about staying longer than you have to, or I guess that's probably true about all crime. And you tell me from a profiler's perspective, would it be fair to say that anytime you have a crime or, a major crime or a violent crime, and the offender is repeatedly doing behaviors that are unnecessary to commit the crime, that it's something we should pay attention to it? And I only say that because, thinking about what you're describing, the offense that we charge is burglary, for breaking in and taking, whatever. But in reality, just because that is the definition of the offense, that may have zero to do with why the actual offender is going, if that makes sense. That they're breaking into this space, like this person, not for financial gain, for sexual gratification or something else, or to fulfill a fantasy. And that should be because they're doing things that are unnecessary to commit the crime that we're looking at. Maybe that should cause investigators to pause at moments. Is that fair to say?
That would be fair to say. I would say anytime you see unnecessary behavior, that's what you have to focus in on and see if you see that in other types of crimes or similar crimes or crimes you think may be linked. We're absolutely focusing in on, okay, what's unnecessary here? What's the ritual behavior? That goes to motive. Why are they doing this? Is it financial? Is it sexual? Is it revenge? Is it, that's what you're looking at. What is it, because sometimes spending unnecessary time at a crime scene doesn't necessarily mean it's sexually motivated. It could be, I have to stage this because if I leave it as it is, and the police are going to know that I did it. That's the perception of the offender. So you're just always asking, why are they spending this unnecessary time here? Is this some sort of ritual behavior? Are they staging? Are they Was it because there was a reaction of the victim in the offender and that caused them to stay there longer for some reason? So yeah, absolutely focus on the behavior that's unnecessary to accomplish the crime. Even if it's murder, is there extra behavior that's...
Since 1981, Unbound has connected people like you with families worldwide on their self-directed paths out of poverty. A brighter future is possible for these families when we all walk together. Sponsor a child today, and you'll help a family take the first steps on their path. Change their future in just one click. Start walking with your new friend today at unbound.org/walk.
At your job, do you ever have to deal with a nose roller? How about a snub pulley? Well, if you're installing a new conveyor belt system, dealing with the different components can sound like you're speaking a foreign language. Luckily, you've got a team ready to help. Grainger's technical product specialists are fluent in maintenance, repair, and operations. So whenever you want to talk shop, just reach out. Call, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.
Since 1981, Unbound has connected people like you with families worldwide on their self-directed paths out of poverty. A brighter future is possible for these families when we all walk together. Sponsor a child today, and you'll help a family take the first steps on their path. Change their future in just one click. Start walking with your new friend today at unbound.org/walk.
Unnecessary.
Are there things about his burglaries in particular that stick out to you that would have, in retrospect, looking back at them, made you think that this guy could be a rapist or could escalate into being a rapist? Just thinking about his specific case.
Yeah, in the burglaries, there were signs that he was masturbating at the scenes. Now, at the time, they didn't collect any samples that might have been there. I don't even know if there were any samples, but there were instances of him using lotion at the crime scenes. There was at one scene there were fingerprints in lotion. In another scene, he had taken lotion and poured it on the carpet down the hallway. Or a woman might come home and to her house and say, well, my lotion was in the bathroom, now it's in the bedroom. So there was this theme, not in every case, and I don't know if it was just that it went unnoticed and that it was only documented in a few scenes, but there were enough scenes where I thought, I think he's masturbating, or that again, there's something more to it. Plus, as you mentioned, he would go into lingerie drawers. In one case, he deconstructed a bra, cut it up.
Really?
He would move items. He would take one earring from a pair as opposed to taking both the earrings. All this kind of behavior that is symbolic in a way and without logic. But to him, it probably has some purpose. But to us, it seems like, why is he doing this? Well, it's because it's serving his purpose. So those were some things. Definitely the lotion was my first key. Like, why is there lotion down the hallway? Why is a bottle of lotion moved from one room to another? Why are there fingerprints and lotion at this scene? So I started to notice that. And then when you look at the sexual assaults in Sacramento that were attributed to the East Area Rapist, in those cases, he used lotion as a lubricant when he sexually assaulted his victims. So
yeah.
So that, I don't know that for a fact when it comes to Visalia, but that was when I read through the reports. Now, the reports for the Visalia burglaries were pretty short because especially at the beginning when they considered them nuisance crimes, nobody was hurt. That was just somebody going into the house. So there'd just be maybe a few lines in the report. And every now and then there'd be something like, oh, the victim noticed that, items were moved from one room to another. or victims noticed that in one case he poured orange juice on their bed. And so these little things that were scattered throughout the many reports that I went through just started to, like, this is just all very illogical, bizarre behavior. And then when you get to the Sacramento area, you see similar types of bizarre behavior. And in this case, you're hearing it directly from the victims, or in my case, reading it from their incident reports directly from the victims. So you have a really good idea of what he's actually doing when he's in their homes, because they're witnesses to this.
One of the things I was going to ask you about that relates to that, when you get away from the ransackings and you start to move toward the rapes, were there things that he, in addition to those behaviors, that he either said or did that were similar? Because when I had been researching, I was surprised. Well, one, I was surprised that a rapist would try to take on couples. So that's one thing. And then, or so many couples, like you would think that the couple that they would go after for a serial rapist would be the exception, didn't know that there were two people there or something like that. And then that he talked so much, that really surprised me, because it's just not what I would imagine someone would do. And there's this one quote where he had said something like that he hated Bonnie, and the woman was not named Bonnie. And I just thought, wow, this guy's talking a lot. Or it was like, I hate you, Bonnie, or something like that.
Yeah. And I think there was confusion over whether he was saying Bonnie or Mommy. And I think everyone decided it was Bonnie because it turned out he had a former girlfriend named Bonnie. However, what I had noticed in that particular case, right before that incident, there had been an article in the newspaper where they had interviewed, I think, like a forensic psychiatrist. And the guy said something about, well, he's probably has issues with his mother. And then in the next crime, he's saying, if you don't do what I say, my mommy's not going to like that. And then there was this mumbling, I hate Mommy. I hate you, Mommy. And I didn't know. But then, of course, I think the victim in that case wasn't sure. Was he saying Bonnie or Mommy? I thought it might be Mommy because of the previous news articles. Because one of the things I did do, I don't think I've ever talked about this, I would take the news articles that were appearing in the paper and to see if he would alter his behavior based on that. If he was paying attention to the news. And I think he was. So my thought was, well, maybe he's saying Mommy. I don't really know for sure because he's never talked. He's never told us, was he saying Bonnie or Mommy? But then once he's identified, we find out he had this girlfriend, fiance, that they had broken up prior to any of this starting, and her name was Bonnie. So I don't know, but he did talk a lot, and he had weird phrasing and unique phrasing, things that he would say, which I thought was pretty interesting. I thought that was one of the suggestions I made. Everything that he ever said, I think, should be released to the public to see if anyone recognizes the way he said things or the words that he used, because it was unique and it was very odd. But you're right, he did talk a lot and he mumbled a lot too. I thought that was something that was probably something he did when he was under stress. And because in fact, a few of the victims thought there might be more than one offender because it sounded as if he was talking to somebody. But, now we know he wasn't, but he was talking to himself. And that was something that a witness in Visalia had reported, seeing somebody peeping in a window, and he started following the guy, and the guy was mumbling. And I believe that was one of the true sightings of the Visalia Ransacker. and he was mumbling. He got very upset. And I thought that's probably a characteristic that people who know him would recognize in him, because I
It
think
would
that's,
pop out sometimes.
yeah, I thought he would be odd. I thought that people would know him to be odd. And when he got upset or stressed out, he'd start mumbling to himself, talking to himself. I thought that was one of his real characteristics.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because it wouldn't be what I would imagine. And then I also think about things like, there was, and I've seen this replayed, I think, in documentaries and probably on Criminal Minds and an assortment of other places. I may be wrong about Criminal Minds, but I know I've seen it on TV several times. But this idea of invading a home with couples, and it almost seemed like, even though he was sexually assaulting the women, it seemed like, in a way, whatever he was playing out, both were a part of it. And it's the thing that sticks in my mind, but it's not the only thing. But was this idea of doing things like taking dishes and put them on the man's back and telling them he was going to kill everybody in the house if the dishes rattled. It almost seemed like he wanted to find couples. Is that fair?
Yes, I think he specifically targeted couples. And I think that the male victims in these cases were part of his fantasy. They were not obstacles or incidental obstacles he had to overcome. They were central to his fantasy of overpowering and controlling and dominating another man. Why else would you do that? Such a high risk behavior. Not only are you dealing with, two victims, but you have a male victim as well. And that puts him at a much greater risk. Why would you do that? And I think people think, well, he's so tough and bold and brazen. And I didn't see it that way. I think he's really insecure.
It's very funny because I'm getting the exact same feeling, because I was thinking as you were saying that, I was like, why does somebody need to play out this fantasy of overpowering people, breaking into their houses and messing with their stuff, if, like, somewhere in your head it's not about sort of lording over people? And
Right.
yeah, and people who are confident tend to not need to lord over people. So you could say, like, maybe, I don't know if courage is the right word, that it takes some guts or willingness to take risks or whatever to do it. But it's almost the opposite of somebody who intrinsically is confident, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I see what the people's point is. Why would he do that? He must be tough. He must be bold and brazen. But then you're like, why do all this? What is really going on with him? And my thought was completely the opposite, that he felt ineffective as compared to other men, and possibly jealous of them and what they had. And this was a way to take control and show, look, I can come into your home. I can take your belongings. I can ransack your home. I can sexually assault your female companion. There's nothing you can do. And therefore that makes me the one in control, the powerful one. And you wouldn't do that if you were secure.
Yeah, if you felt it already, there would be no
Right.
need to do it.
Right.
Very little value.
It's the ultimate overcompensation, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, makes complete sense to me. I mean, in thinking back, and thinking about that idea of, to your point about, trying to sort of overcompensate, do you think that the escalation from the ransackings to the rapes to the murders, do you think that some of that was really about, because I imagine for a lot of offenders who have some kind of serial killers, who have some kind of fantasy that they're playing out, and this is the way I imagine in my head, and I have no evidence for it, have done no research for this, but that it's a bit like a heroin habit, right? Like the first time you do heroin and it's amazing, you're always chasing the dragon, as they say. And you're constantly having to up the ante and increase the risk and the amount to try and get that same high or sense of relief, or I guess tap into that same pleasure center in the brain. Do you think that the escalation had to do with that, or do you think there was a more practical, or well, what do you think led to the escalation?
Well, I don't think the escalation was practical in nature. What now knowing what we know about him, so right before his first murders, he was arrested. And now I think a lot of the listeners probably know he was a police officer at the time of many of these crimes. He was a police officer in Exeter, California, which was right next to Visalia. Then he went up to Northern California area and was a police officer with the Auburn Police Department. And he had been arrested for shoplifting. And then he's fired. And in between that incident, there's this, we call it an attempted murder, but I don't know for sure that he went in there with the intent to murder. Now, during that crime, the female victim hears him talking and saying to himself, I'm going to kill him, I'm going to kill him, I'm going to kill him. I don't recall that he ever said that in any of the other cases. He would threaten people, if you move or make a sound, I'll kill you. But nobody ever heard him talking to himself the way this female victim heard him talking. So when
Which I imagine would be more alarming, right? Like
it's very alarming.
Yeah.
And so because of that, she's able to get up. She gets out the front door. She's tied up, but she's hopping out the front door. She's screaming. And then her male companion, the male victim, hears that. He gets out the back door. So you have the female victim running out the front door, male victim running out the back door. Things just went completely wrong. And they're screaming. And so all this is going on all at once. You have the arrest. You have this completely failed attempt. Now, whether he was going to kill him or not, I don't know. But it was the first time he truly failed. And then the next time is when he does kill two victims, and he shoots them. And in this case, the male victim got out of his bindings. And it was prior to the female. Usually what he would do is he'd go in, he'd tie them up, he'd separate the male and the female victims. And this was prior to that. And the female victim or the male victim got out of his bindings. So DeAngelo shoots him and then shoots the female victim. So there's no sexual assault. So again, things have gone really wrong.
So that is also probably, and thinking about it from the perspective of his fantasy, that's probably also a failure too.
It's a complete failure, and it's a complete lack of control, which is what we know he probably needs most in the world, is to control things. And so you have all these things going on. And now, I mean, I can look back and look at, what we've learned about him and see these things now. At the time, we don't have this information, but you certainly can suspect he is trying to get the ultimate control here. And why? Is there something that's gone on in his life? Is it that this was just a natural progression, a natural escalation? But now I see that, it was a natural escalation, but largely based on what was going on in his personal life and the lack of control he had at the time.
Well, and see, that's so, in the moment as you're working on the profile, and I was going to ask about how you even became involved in the case, but as you're working on the profile, you don't have that information. And I'm so curious about how you take the information you have to make sort of reasonable deductions about what could be in that empty space that you hadn't have. But how did you even become involved in the case? Because one of the things I think a lot of people assume well, it depends. You watch Criminal Minds or not. If you watch Criminal Minds, you think that the selection process to have the BAU assigned to your case is very complex and lots of different layers. And I think there are other people who believe the BAU works every serial case. How did you get involved? How does the FBI get involved in cases like this? And how does that process work of building a profile?
So we got involved in this case, as we do most cases, at the request of the investigating agency. So in this particular case, it was the Sacramento County Sheriff's Office that requested our assistance in analyzing the case, coming up with a profile of the unknown offender, investigative suggestions. Now, they weren't asking for linkage analysis, but as I've already mentioned, I thought that would be important for understanding this offender. Can we link Visalia? And if we can, I think that gives us even more insight into him. So that's how I got involved. My boss at the time just called me into his office, and I had followed this case since about 2004. I saw a special on A&E, and I was on maternity leave with my son. It was in the middle of the day, and I'm watching true crime documentaries, and they covered this case. And it was, I think I mentioned it was in 2001 where they'd linked the sexual assaults and the homicides through DNA. Then A&E did this special, and I thought, wow, that is an incredible case. So I followed it. And at the time, it was called, the offender was known as the East Area Rapist, original Nightstalker. And so when my boss called me into his office, he said, "Have you ever heard of the East Area Rapist or East Area?" And I go, "East Area Rapist? Yes, I'll take it."
And that's why when you said boss, that's why everyone should have to watch true crime.
So that's how I got involved. He knew, we don't get a lot of serial murder cases. I know everyone probably thinks that the BAU works on every serial murder case. We don't. And we don't have like a bunch going on at once. Usually there's always one or two cases being worked on in the unit at a time, but it's really not that frequent as I guess people would think. And so when this one came in, my boss basically asked me, did I want to work on this case? And I said, yep, I'm already familiar with it. I'm very interested in working on it. So that's how I got involved. And it was at the request of the investigating agencies. And of course, at the time, they had formed all the different agencies, and there was about, I'm going to say 15 jurisdictions had gotten together to form a working group.
Oh, wow.
And it was the first time, and this is back in 2011, I think. It was the first time all these agencies had gotten together and they decided we're going to share all our files. We're going to let everybody read everything. And we're going to put our heads together and we're going to solve this thing. We're going to do, something. Maybe somebody from another jurisdiction will notice something in another file.
How unusual was that for that many agencies to get together? I mean, because one of the things I think about often that I imagine there's a lot of trouble in solving crimes simply because offenders cross jurisdictions. That's a great sort of countermeasures to walk over the county line or the city line or the state line. Does that happen often, or is, well, I guess 15 jurisdictions, I guess there may not be offenders that are quite that prolific.
Yeah, I mean, it's not the first time I've seen agencies get together, and we've had meetings with multiple agencies because an offender has been operating in several different jurisdictions, but this was the largest group that I'd been a part of. I mean, 15 was quite a number. So, but I don't think it's that unusual. I think law enforcement agencies have gotten better about communicating with one another and sharing information and getting together and looking over each other's files. I think that it's improved over the years and communication has improved.
Okay. So, what is the process like for you on this case? Do you start with files in Quantico, or how does that work?
Yep. I just sat down at my desk and opened up the first case. I went chronologically and just started reading, and I spent I think it's about 6 months probably reading through everything and
Wow.
really having an understanding of each offense. I wrote reports on almost every offense as well. And when I say reports, I would write out what occurred, the victims, where it was located, what occurred. Was there anything unusual? Did he say something? I mean, I just kept track of all of that. And that took a while. And I just did it chronologically. And then I, also reviewed not only the incident reports, but if there were crime scene photos, autopsy reports, descriptions of the offender, if any any witnesses described, oh, I saw a man running off, or I came face to face with a guy and he ran the other direction, or I followed this guy, or I saw this guy peeping. I tried to read all of those. What I didn't spend a lot of time on were all the different people that were called in, like all the different
The
suspects.
suspects. Right. Right.
There were 7,000
Wow. 7,000 suspects. Wow.
at least.
Well, and I imagine even with a shorter number, let's say it's 7, paying maybe too much attention to the suspects in the beginning might get in the way of building your profile. Is that fair?
That would be fair. I think it's much better to, I'm pretty good at blocking out information that might bias me. Like people can tell me their theories, or I can hear about the, different suspects. That is not going to alter when I'm looking at the actual, crime summaries or incident reports or autopsy reports. I can all block out. So, but it's not really that helpful to go through all the different suspects that had been called in. Because so many of them could potentially fit. So it's like, yeah, that guy, he could be him. He could be. I mean, I might have 1,000 people that might match.
Right. Right.
Maybe not 1,000, but I just thought that my time is better spent analyzing the crime and analyzing the interaction between the offender and the victims, and analyzing anything that would give me insight into his behavior.
Well, after you got through that 6 months, what impression were you left with?
Well, I was left. My initial impressions, they developed. I started with them, and then as I continued to go through the reports and the files, it just kind of kept building and getting reinforced. But my initial impressions were that ransacking, and I know this sounds obvious, but ransacking was key to him. This is really an important thing that he needs to accomplish in order to gain satisfaction from this crime. And what I noticed, every case he ransacked. And because we had so many victims who, I should call them survivors, with so many survivors of this offender, we knew that he ransacked. This wasn't something he did after the fact. He did this first, before any sexual assault ever occurred. In every single case, he ransacked. And it was a significant amount of ransacking. And then he'd go back to the victim. And if he sexually assaulted a victim more than once, he would ransack the home in between. So that really stuck out to me.
That's interesting.
Yeah. That's unusual behavior.
So like the ransacking is almost like the start button.
Yes.
Like for the whole process. Yeah.
Yeah. It's really important, which is something that, took me back to Visalia. That ransacking is clearly very important to that offender as well. So that was one of the things. I think the other thing that there's several impressions that I had initially, and they all kind of, from my initial impression to my final analysis, it didn't change a lot. It just maybe was more solidified. But I again saw a very insecure person. I saw a person who was uncomfortable with having any kind of physical combat with another man. Like he wasn't going to do it. If rather than fight or physically fight another man, he'd rather just shoot him, and which is a very high risk and increases the risk that he will get caught. So I thought he doesn't want to have a fight with another man. I felt he was very insecure. I thought he would be odd. What were some other impressions I was left with? Oh, another really important thing, that he was very tactical. He did some things that led me to believe not only was he very accurate with his shooting under a high stress situation, and he would escalate immediately. He was very comfortable escalating immediately to deadly force with a firearm. So I thought he was very comfortable. I thought he might even have formalized training.
Very law enforcement kind of military to be able to escalate quickly and still be accurate.
Yeah, I thought there was some sort of formal training in firearms at some point in his life. The other thing he did that I thought was reminiscent of a potential training in law enforcement was when he would go into the homes, he would shine a flashlight in the victim's eyes to blind them. That's what police officers do when they come up to a car. They may shine a light in there, and it gives them the advantage. They can see what's in the car, and yet the person they've pulled over, I was going to call them the offender, but whoever they've pulled over is at a disadvantage. They can't see as well when they're blinded. So, and then another thing that was interesting that was pointed out to me by a listener, which I was thinking that's a really good observation, and I can't believe I didn't think of it myself, was when, he would go into the home, he'd have the female victim bind the male victim, then he would bind the female victim, and then he would then bind the male victim again, kind of on top of the bindings that the female victim had placed.
Ooh, wow.
And one listener pointed out that's it. And I'm like, I never even thought of this, but he's absolutely right. And I can't believe I didn't think about it. But that's also a law enforcement tactic if you're switching handcuffs with somebody, or changing handcuffs. Like you're going to get your handcuffs off somebody and somebody else is going to put their handcuffs on. You have two sets of cuffs on them.
Like a daisy chain. Yep.
Right. Yeah. But a listener, like he was, I think he was a police officer. He's like, this is very practical in that he did this as well. And I'm like, that's a really good observation as well. But which again goes back to,
it's kind of the way an officer would deal with having the horrible situation of having to deal with two suspects, one officer.
At your job, do you ever have to deal with a nose roller? How about a snub pulley? Well, if you're installing a new conveyor belt system, dealing with the different components can sound like you're speaking a foreign language. Luckily, you've got a team ready to help. Grainger's technical product specialists are fluent in maintenance, repair, and operations. So whenever you want to talk shop, just reach out. Call, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.
Since 1981, Unbound has connected people like you with families worldwide on their self-directed paths out of poverty. A brighter future is possible for these families when we all walk together. Sponsor a child today, and you'll help a family take the first steps on their path. Change their future in just one click. Start walking with your new friend today at unbound.org/walk.
At the same time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It really didn't occur to me. And I wish it had, because it would have even reinforced my thought that he had prior law enforcement training of some sort. But there were other things. I mean, he's very tactical and very good at what he did. And I was a little bit, it comes this gray area. Is he really good at what he does because he does it so much, or did he also have some formal training? And I just thought, I think there were some things about his actions that indicated to me he had some sort of formalized training. And I actually thought he was a police officer. I wasn't alone in that. There were some of the detectives, I think, thought he was a police officer as well. There were some detectives that thought there's no way a police officer would do these things. So it's a little touchy of a subject. I can understand why. You don't want to think it's one of your own that could be doing this. So those were some of my initial impressions of him.
One of the things that was really interesting to me about what you just said, or was interesting to me, was you mentioned he didn't want to get into a physical altercation with a man, and obviously that tying them up was a part of it. Were there times, other than the shooting of the police officer, the journalism professor, were there times where there were physical fights during the period of the East Area rapes in between Visalia and Sacramento before those phases?
No, not that I'm aware of.
Wow.
And there was a news article I found. Well, I didn't find it. Somebody else found it, and I saw it posted somewhere. So I shouldn't say I found it posted somewhere. But it was an article that was written about an arrest or some sort of law enforcement action he had participated in. And I guess he caught somebody breaking into a car and he chased the guy and the guy got away. And I thought that's kind of interesting because he was really physically fit. He outran people when he was chased a few times and pretty close calls, but really fast, really physically fit. And I kind of wondered, did that guy get away?
Or did he let him get away?
Or did he let him get away because he didn't want to put his hands on him? So, and if you think about it too, being a police officer for some people is about being powerful, being in control. It's not always about justice. It is for most people, but if you have a very insecure type, I could see them wanting to go into law enforcement so they can be in control of people and tell them what to do. And it's a powerful position.
Yeah, it's kind of like that thing. Not every boss is a sadist, but you're going to find your sadists as bosses. Or
that's exactly right.
Right. Yeah. All right. Well, which brings me actually to another thing I was really interested in. You had mentioned earlier that you had looked at the news articles to see if his behaviors changed, and I had wondered how much he paid attention to the news, and I know he had sent a poem to the Sacramento Bee, which had been covering
that he did not do that. That's
it's not true.
No,
okay,
that is not true. Yeah, so there was a poem. Do you remember the name of it?
I do not.
It's like, I forget, but it's a strange poem. That was something I had asked the detectives about, because that would change a little bit of the profile if he's trying to communicate or taunt police. And there was this idea he's taunting police. But so that poem, I did talk with one of the detectives from the Sacramento County Sheriff's Office, and they actually identified, they had received similar communications and they had identified who had sent those other communications. So they believed this was somebody else other than the East Area Rapist. They actually had identified who had sent that. But that became part of the myth that he had written that poem. But I don't believe that he did.
Okay. Are there any other things along those lines? Because I had heard about, at one point, they believed he had dropped kind of very similar to the which case is it? The Long Island serial case, but homework pages for his crimes, but then a map too of a suburban neighborhood that they couldn't identify. Like there is no neighborhood that existed like that.
Yeah. So near one of the crime scenes, they found some, like you said, some homework, what appeared to be some homework from a student. And this drawing. It was all on notebook paper. This drawing of what appeared to be a neighborhood, but it was not a neighborhood that anyone recognized as being a real neighborhood. It was almost like just a rendering of a neighborhood or a future neighborhood or something. And that was just, it was something that needed to be looked at to see, can we identify whose homework this belonged to, or who drew this neighborhood, or was this part of an assignment of some sort? And it's never been connected. I know one of the detectives, we went down that rabbit hole looking, which is, it had to be done, but it was never connected to him. I don't believe it was connected at all. That was always my impression. I don't think it has anything to do with it.
Could be somebody's just sort of imagining the neighborhood that they wish existed, as opposed to what was there.
It could be some sort of assignment where you're supposed to draw something. It could have just been for fun. I mean, it didn't seem like, it seemed like, okay, there was some homework and then there was this drawing of this neighborhood. So it wasn't clear, was this drawing for some sort of assignment? Because they were two separate things. Whatever they were, if they were homework, they're for different classes. But they were found together. So it's just really hard to say, but it's never been tied to the crime, to Joe DeAngelo. It's just never been. And I think it was just something that needed to be looked at, but I don't think that there's a connection.
One I also hear about, and I don't know whether this is true either, was that at different points between the 70s and the early 90s, some of the victims or survivors from the East Area Rapists received phone calls from people, and they thought the voices sounded like, including some threatening ones, sounded like the offender.
Right.
Were they able to get any insight from those?
No. It was my colleague on this, Bob, and I, he worked on this case with me, and Bob Drew. And our thought was it probably was him. That was probably something he would do, but we don't have any concrete evidence that it was. The victims say it sounded like him, the way he talked, disguising his voice, talking through clenched teeth. And it's certainly something we wouldn't put it past him, but because he's never talked, we can't ask him. We don't have those answers. Did you make these calls? So we don't know for sure. But I don't rule that out. Now, I rule out the poem. Not really sure those other documents were related to him, because he would have been much older than what it appeared those assignments were for. Like, they looked like they were probably for maybe a high school student. So he would have been much older. So I don't think those are related. Phone calls, I'm on the fence about. I don't know for sure.
Could be. Yeah.
Yeah.
If he had made those phone calls, what's because something very similar, I just mentioned the Long Island serial killer case, happened in the sense that, with at least one of his victims, he used her cell phone to call and taunt her family members. Part of me thinks in the Long Island case, that appears to me to be just sort of, straight sadism, torturing them. But I'm wondering, in listening to the way that you described DeAngelo, could there have been other reasons, such as, like, if this is all really about his, I guess sadism is about control, but if this is a period where he can't, or he's gotten older and he can't do it, might somebody substitute to other ways of sort of exerting control over people?
Yeah, I think that could very well be it. I think it's also an extension. I think he had sadistic tendencies. Now, when I talk about sadism with him, it's much more mental than it is physical, because he didn't inflict gratuitous violence on his victims. He wasn't inflicting pain just to see someone in pain. That he really only got violent if he was met with resistance.
So it was a practical violence.
It was practical, where he was confronted or he was met with resistance or somebody wasn't compliant. But if people complied, then he wasn't inflicting, pain on them. But yet, by tying them up and going through their house and putting them in that fear.
Control.
Yeah, that is sadistic. That is kind of based in the same feeling of wanting to cause harm to people, and you gain enjoyment from harming people, whether it's physical, whether it's emotional. So I think the phone calls could be an extension of that. And it's also probably somewhat exhilarating to call them and know he's scaring them. They've already been through the worst thing of their life, and he knows he's just prolonging it, and probably had a sense of satisfaction out of that if he did in fact make those calls. That would be my my opinion of why he did it.
Did you ever get any sense of how he wanted to be perceived? I know this is going to sound like a weird question, but how he wanted to be perceived by the survivors in the East Area Rapist? Because I just think it's obviously he wanted to frighten them. He wanted them to be scared, but it doesn't sound like. Yeah, I don't know what he was getting out of the interaction. I'm curious what you thought, what he wanted to leave them with in terms of his impression.
I think he wanted to leave him with the impression that he had taken the ultimate control of them. That's what I think. I don't think it's much deeper than that. And of course, that control came in a lot of different forms, from not only going into their house and taking control of their entire space, but binding them and blindfolding them and taking away their senses and separating couples from one another, all these things. But I think, so you see so many different layers of this control that he's exerting on people. And I think ultimately that is what this was all about. And that's what he wanted to leave them with, is that I have controlled everything. I've taken everything away from you. Particularly, I'm a powerful enough man that I can take everything away from another man.
Mm. So why, and I know you can't fully answer this question, but I'll ask it anyway.
Try me. Probably not.
Right? No.
It's hard to know. It's hard, some people think, oh, you can get into the mind of a serial killer. I really can't. I think that's maybe some people can. I just try to, it's my best interpretation of their behavior and why would somebody do something. So I can't really get into their minds, but I'll do my best, Jason.
You just don't have to. Right. Don't try and get in their minds. You don't want to. I think you probably don't want to get in the mind of your average, relatively healthy person, much less a serial killer. But for me, if it's all about sort of like lording and taking control over over other people, and I get that. I understand how somebody could be motivated that way. I understand how it all connects. But what I guess I don't get is, and I do get that death is the ultimate control over someone. But okay, so when I listen to this story, what I have a story of, not that it needs to make sense to me, I have a man who is very attracted to, for whatever reason, ransacking. Whether that ransacking involves just ransacking or rapes or murders, that's the key element that runs through. We have this ransacker. What I guess I don't understand is, why would someone escalate to murder when murder is not really what they're there for, if that makes sense? that they're driven by this sense of power and control that comes in many different forms. Why escalate to murder, which carries, particularly when you are a police officer, you know it carries enormous risks. You know, as a police officer, that a rape is not investigated like a murder, that a burglary is not investigated like a rape or a murder, that a murder gets a whole nother level. Particularly a home invasion, murder of, doctors in one instance, or like, why do you think that escalation occurred?
Well, I think it was, and it's really hard to know what his mental state was. But I think at the time, as I mentioned, there were some things going on in his life, and he was kind of spiraling, not only in his regular, normal, everyday life, being caught for shoplifting. He's going to get fired, and he ultimately did get fired as a police officer. And then the two cases where things just went completely wrong. And I think for whatever reason, that had a significant impact on him. And he was not going to let any more victims survive. And I don't know why. I don't think he considered the risks at the time. I think he thought he was minimizing those risks with all the steps he would take with, he wore a mask and, over his head. He disguised his voice. He wore gloves. He blindfolded the victims. He, tied them up. He not only blindfolded them, but sometimes would put things over their head. So it made it very difficult to identify him. And so I think he just thought, I've taken all these steps to minimize, so I'm not going to get caught. And I don't think he thought he was going to get caught.
And that the murder itself may have also been something that minimized things, that, I would wonder at that moment, like thinking about that transition, did he read something in the news? Did one of his survivors or victims say something that made him think, oh, crap? Or did, something come out? Because it's just really interesting to me. I would have never thought it as, in some ways, the murders themselves, you eliminate.
I don't think it was necessarily something, somebody said something. I mean, what we're dealing with is, in some ways, someone who's very fragile.
Right.
Very fragile sense of
Scared.
themselves.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, so much so that they turn to rape and murder to cope. That's what we're dealing with. And we're trying to make sense of why he's doing these things, and they're just not going to make sense. But if you think about it, he is so insecure that he's turning to these things to cope. And he also had a temper. I mean, there's descriptions of him from neighbors who had interactions with him of getting angry and mumbling. And he called one neighbor and he's threatened, left a message, he was going to kill their dog or something like that. I mean, he didn't react normally to stressful situations where most of us would just be, let's just let it go. And his neighbor would say he'd be walking and pacing in the backyard, mumbling about something. And so we're just not dealing with somebody who handles normal everyday stress or insecurities the same way as other people.
Yeah, because
that's the best way I can describe it.
Do you think that there are any lessons other than lock my doors at night and make sure all the windows are locked, but lessons that people can learn, or law enforcement also can learn through cases like this? Because I'm thinking and listening to this, there are like a couple things that, just as an example, that comes to mind to me. I know I would feel violated if there were a burglar in my house who broke in. But listening to what you said, like what that burglar does when they break into my house might be even more disturbing or less disturbing, right? If they take all the computers and walk out, that's completely different than if they go through the underwear drawer. Or And I mean, are there any things that we or law enforcement can learn? And also, like what is the realistic reality? What's the likelihood of coming across somebody like DeAngelo? I imagine it's infinitesimally small.
Yeah, and you mentioned what to look for in burglaries and things, but one thing I want to point out, just as a caution to victims of burglaries, even if someone comes in your house and just takes electronics, you certainly be cognizant that sometimes they'll come back to the very same house. So just because they were successful, they might come back, and it could be completely financially motivated. So I'm just going to throw that out there. Don't
Good
think you're
point.
safe. Yeah, I've seen this. And this actually happened to a coworker's neighbor where they were burglarized twice, and they did the second time around. They caught the guys, and they had burglared their house. Not even that far in the past. So just something to keep in mind. I think one of the most important lessons, and this is quite a simple lesson, is don't trust composites. Or be very careful. And I've just learned this, not just with this case, but be very careful with eyewitness descriptions of people, whether it's a suspect or another person or something they've seen really quickly happen, but just eyewitness identification, because we had so many different, people who saw this offender, and all the descriptions are very different. And they, early on, many detectives completely discounted that Visalia could be related because the composites didn't match. So I think this is just another lesson about just don't trust eyewitnesses. I mean, obviously, you take that information, but take it with a grain of salt.
Right.
So, and then the other lesson, the bigger lesson, is never give up. When I started out my career in law enforcement, I never believed the advances in technology that we see today, and cases that some people have given up hope have been solved, not only with DNA, but with deathbed confessions or people that come forward with information. I just did an interview with 2 detectives on a case, and it's going to be on our show. And the case had gone cold, and they had very little in the way of forensic evidence. And what broke the case was an ex-wife who turned her husband in for the murder. And of course, they get that tip. It takes them another 16 months to investigate and put together a case against this guy, but you never know. And so I would say never give up.
I like that. That's a good positive note. You're like an internal optimist. We just had a very long conversation about a serial killer, and you found the optimistic note. I think
when you work on these cases, you have to, it really is, these are hard cases, and they're tragic and horrific, and you can't imagine what some of these victims go through. But in my role as a profiler, I've seen such dedication, and I mean, detectives who never give up. And law enforcement often takes a beating, but I will tell you that many of these detectives want, just as much as the victims' families. These cases become that important to them, and the victims' families become that important to them.
Well, it's been a theme of the year for me in listening to a lot of my guests, whether it's somebody like Julie Murray, whose sister Maura disappeared, or a guest earlier I had on this year, Monty Frank, whose native daughter was missing and was murdered. But even people, I had a storm chasing photographer on recently talking about the trauma that's related to it, but like a reoccurring theme for all these really interesting people I've had on this year has been don't give up hope. That when you get to that point where you give up hope, all is lost because it's the fuel that sort of just keeps us going and bringing good things into the world. So I like that.
Yeah. That's how you get through the day, right? I mean, why do this job if you're just going to give up? There's no point. So you can never give up. That's
with you.
my thought for the day.
I'm with you. I'm putting on hard.
I do tend to be pretty optimistic.
Yeah, same here.
But I've seen amazing things. That's why I have if I've never seen any cases ever get solved, then I wouldn't, I probably wouldn't be an optimist. But because I've seen so many what I thought could be very difficult cases and almost impossible cases, and you just get that one phone call and then that's it. And they're off, and the next thing you know, there's an arrest made and conviction, and it's unbelievable. You can't give up.
Yep. All right. Thanks, Julia. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Jason. I appreciate it as well.
Thanks for joining us today. If you'd like to join us for more discussions with me and other listeners, we can be found on most social media platforms, including a listener-run Facebook group called the Silver Linings Fireside Chat. For deeper conversations with our guests and live conversations with other listeners, you can also join us on our Patreon at www.patreon.com/The Silver Linings Handbook. I'm Jason Blair, and this is the Silver Linings Handbook. We'll see you all again next week.
If you're a facilities manager at a warehouse and your HVAC system goes down, it can turn up the heat, literally. But don't sweat it, Grainger has you covered. Grainger offers over 1 million industrial-grade products for all your operations, including warehouse HVAC maintenance. And even better, they offer access to experts and fast delivery, so you and your warehouse can both keep your cool. Call 1-800-GRAINGER, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.
Since 1981, Unbound has connected people like you with families worldwide on their self-directed paths out of poverty. A brighter future is possible for these families when we all walk together. Sponsor a child today, and you'll help a family take the first steps on their path. Change their future in just one click. Start walking with your new friend today at unbound.org/walk.